Okay. Well, welcome to History Night in Springettsbury Township. This is a venue of the Springettsbury Township Historic Preservation Committee. The plan is to offer these free events, 3 times a year from 7 o'clock until 8:30 in the evening during the second Wednesday of April, July, and October. Thanks to Debbie Riedifer for hosting this event. Give her a round. Yeah, this Glazed auction house was formerly the Glazed 2-room schoolhouse for over 100 years. First, a little housekeeping. Please silence your phones. The restrooms are located out the side door and to the left. And no, they're not outhouses. They're regular bathrooms. Other than when I ask a question of this gathering, I'd appreciate if you would hold your questions and discussion until the end of the talk. Now, as with all history nights, this event is being recorded, and when the content will be viewable as a YouTube video on the Springettsbury Township website about 2 weeks after the talk. So if you're going to review it again, it will be available in about 2 weeks. Now, I'm Stephen H. Smith. I'm chairman of the Springettsbury Township Historic Preservation Committee. I will be presenting the program tonight in addition to presenting the program at the next History Night, which will be on Wednesday, July 13th, when I will explore early businesses in Springettsbury. That event will focus on businesses in the township prior to 1940. So it will focus on items such as mills, blacksmith shops, wheelwright shops, to early factories, early service stations, stores, inns, taverns, and restaurants, all before 1940. So that will be July 13th of this year. It will probably be in the firehouse on Commons Drive, but we haven't really set that for sure yet, but that's probably where it will be located. Now, the featured presentation tonight is Early Schooling in Springettsbury. I'll explore how and where students were taught in Springettsbury Township from its inception through the 1950s when Central York and York Suburban School Districts were established. I'll examine one-room schools, consolidated schools, and something unique to York County, an independent school district, which resulted in the 2 school districts that we have today. Sources for this presentation primarily come from the collections of the York County History Center, from materials donated to the Springettsbury Township Historic Preservation Committee, and from early local newspapers researchable on newspapers.com. Now, the underlying photo in my title slide is this photo of Mrs. Charlotte Hively's class of 1st and 2nd graders at Pleasurable School in 1946. Years ago, that photo was donated to our committee and placed in our archives. If you have materials or copies of materials related to life in Springettsbury Township, consider sharing them with us. The Pleasurable School building shown here opened in 1929. It provided a modern, consolidated Pleasureville area school, which took the place of 3 earlier schoolhouses in the area. With additions, it was utilized for education of students in the Pleasureville area through 1982. Raise your hand if you were ever a student at this schoolhouse. Oh, you got okay, we got at least 6. That's good. Now, Irma Throne Daron provided a common thread that runs through this presentation. As a student, she attended the Stony Brook one-room schoolhouse. As a teacher, Irma taught at 5 schoolhouses within the township. Prior to teaching at the Springettsbury Township Consolidated school building, which was where the township park is. After school district consolidation, Irma continued in the Central York School District as predominantly a second grade teacher at the Springsbury Elementary School, at Pleasureville, at North Hills, and at Hayshire Schools before finishing a 44-year career during 1970 as a second grade teacher at Stony Brook Elementary School. So raise your hand if you ever had Irma Darren as one of your teachers. One, great. Maybe you can share some stories later.
I remember very little.
Okay, second grade? Okay, yeah, we don't remember very little. First or second?
Can I ask one little question?
Yes.
Mrs. Hively was Miss Throne. Were they sisters by any chance?
Well, they were, I think they were. Yeah, I think they were. I have to look in that a little bit further, so nice question. Now, essentially, the topics tonight will cover about an hour and 20 minutes on the presentation. First topic is earliest schoolhouses in the Springsbury Township. The second topic, I'll look at early schooling experiences as shared by students and teachers. 3, I'll provide an overview of the modern schools, which were started by the Springsbury Independent School District in 1912. And 4, I'll close with a brief look at the survivors, the 8 repurposed schoolhouses still standing in Springsbury Township. Now, when Springsbury Township was established in 1891, it contained 8 schoolhouses to which all students walked to school. So if you were in the far reaches out Glazed Valley, you had the longest walk, pretty much. And that would probably be about almost 2 miles. So you can see, like, if you're down here in Lefevre's and you're in here, you had to walk that far. So each one-room school had their own territory set up by the school board. Now, in 1848, Spring Garden Township then encompassed all of the present Springsbury Township. They voted to enact local taxes to gain a state appropriation in order to provide free public education for students from the 1st through 8th grades. That was all because of Pennsylvania passed an act that was the Act of 1834. The Act of 1834 provided common schooling. Now, common schooling prior to that did not exist. You basically went to private schools or church schools. So in 1834, they passed this law, but each municipality had to enact local property taxes in order to gain a state appropriation, and there were townships in York County that enacted it immediately in 1834, but they were few and far between. Most of them did not enact common schools until 1848, when the provided additional incentives, the state provided additional incentives. And with the additional incentives, there was a whole slew of townships that enacted taxes. However, there were holdouts in southwestern York County that did not enact common schools until 1878. So you had that whole range. Now, Spring Garden Township enacted it in 1848. So they were kind of right in the middle. And the voters of Spring Garden Township, they elected a school board which used the local taxes and the state appropriation to hire teachers and make the necessary preparations to start common schooling within Spring Garden Township during the fall of 1849. Now, the school board gradually built school buildings. However, in the initial years, they primarily rented space in any available building to provide schooling. However, that first year, 1848, a state report noted Spring Garden School Board did open 2 of their own built schoolhouses, Fryestown and Lefevre's. Now, Fryestown School was in the area that remained in Spring Garden Township until being annexed into the eastern part of York City. And Lefevre's was in the area of Spring Garden Township that would become Springettsbury Township in 1891. With that early experience, the school board determined it was more economical to construct their own school buildings. Now, of the school buildings that Springettsbury Township took control of when they separated from Spring Garden Township, which were the oldest? I'll look at these schoolhouses in the order that they were built. So the first one that was built was Lefevre's. Now, explaining the nomenclature, forming the label on each slide. The first number is the year the photo was taken. So this was taken in 1911. Lefevre's is the name of the school, and the other numbers over there from 1841, 1849 to 1912 is the range of years in which they were schooling students in that particular building. Now, Lefevre's schoolhouse was named after John and Eve Lefevre, who provided a lot for a public schoolhouse on August 11th, 1849. The Lefevre's owned a farm on which much of Haynes Acres would eventually be built 100 years later in the future. So Lefevre's one-room schoolhouse was completed as a brick structure in time for the start of the then 4-month-long school session. So in 1849, school year was 4 months long. It started in November, ended in February. You wanted your kids available to do the farming the other months. So they had it over winter. So you basically were in these schoolhouses and they had to be heated. So I'll get to that a little bit later. Now, in terms of present roads, Lefevre's was located on the east side of Haynes Road, a short distance south of Eastern Boulevard. Lefevre's was torn down after it ceased being used for schooling very close to 1912. Now, as shown in this 1941 photo, Glazed schoolroom had separate entrances side by side for the side-by-side classrooms. The primary room housed all students in grades 1 through 4, and the grammar room housed all students in grades 5 through 8. Which you attended here, which room was that was primary. Okay, primary was on the east side, and grammar was on the west side. Okay. The primary room essentially was a mirror image of the grammar room. You can actually see where the chimneys were for each one over there. So you had the stove on either side here, and you had a wall down the middle. And you can actually see where they took the wall out here to produce the Glazed auction room. Now, you had windows on the side and then back walls back there. And these walls were for the blackboards. Most schools had actually boards painted black, but a lot of schools actually had slate boards. I think you said these are slate boards? Slate boards in here? Okay, so this was a higher class school then. Because actually most of them I found were actually painted wood. On August 11th, 1849, John Blauser and his wife Elizabeth deeded a lot for the schoolhouse on this property. Back then, the road names were different than they are now. In early deeds, Brook Valley Road was known as Vinegar Ferry Road because it led to the site where Vinegar Ferry crossed the Susquehanna River. And Trout Run Road was known as Furnace Road since it's led to Cador's Furnace. So essentially, the road names changed, I think, in the 1940s or 30s. Does anybody know the exact date? It's probably in that range because that's when I see it change in deeds. The state report that noted that Spring Garden School District only had built 2 schools in 1849, Fryestown and the Fevers, tend to point that Glazed Schoolhouse was opened probably 1850 or soon thereafter, since the Glazed lot was purchased in 1849 on the exact same date when the Fevers lot was purchased. The 2-room brick schoolhouse was constructed due to a reasonably dense early population in this area. The brickwork is similar to that in the Lefevre schoolhouse, if you compare photos. So perhaps the bricklayers that built the Glazed schoolhouse were the same crew that earlier built the Lefevre schoolhouse. The schoolhouse was last used to teach students during the 1951-1952 school year, after which the schoolhouse was sold and repurposed as a combined larger single-room auction house. I'll have more about that later. Now, Hively's Chapel and Hively's School are shown here. This 1929 photo shows Hively's Schoolhouse next to Hively's Chapel. The site of Hively's 1-room schoolhouse was recorded as, quote, at the northern extremity of the premises and plantation of Samuel Hively, end quote, per the York County deed book this deed was in. And in this deed, it appears a private schoolhouse was already on this lot. So when the school directors purchased this school, it appears that it was already a private school at that location, and they made it a public school. Now, the brick schoolhouse was undoubtedly named for Samuel Hively, who owned large acreage west of North Sherman Street. Hively's was a public school in Spring Garden Township and then in Springettsbury Township from 1853 until 1929. In terms of present roadways, that schoolhouse was located west, on the west side of North Sherman Street at Paradise Road. In the fall of 1853, this became the first public schoolhouse to serve the Pleasureville area. And it was likely, like I said, a private school before that, for quite some time before that. After the Pleasureville Consolidated Schoolhouse opened in 1929, up the street, the school directors of Springettsbury Township sold Hively's Schoolhouse to the neighboring Hively's Chapel. Guess why they sold it to them? Hively's Chapel wanted a parking space for all their cars that's shown in this photo. So this is one of the early buildings torn down for a parking lot. Now, on August 2nd, 1850, a lot was set aside for Miller's Schoolhouse at the T intersection between John Miller's and John Strickler's farm. And it appears this pictured brick 1-room schoolhouse opened about 1857. I haven't been able to tie it down exactly, but it appears it's between 1856 and 1858. So I just estimated 1857. In the fall of 1926, after graduating from Millersville, Irma Throme received her first teaching job in Miller's Schoolhouse. Then, after a few years teaching at each of Stony Brook, Glazed Primary, so she taught in Glazed Primary in this room, and Mount Zion, Irma taught at Miller's continuously from 1935 until 1951. The schoolhouse was last used to educate students during the 1951-1952 school year. And the structure continues to stand as a residence. So that's one of the survivors. I went one too fast, I think. Okay. Now, this is the first of 3 schoolhouses in Springettsbury Township named Stony Brook. So there were 3 of them. On March 12, 1859, David Whitmer sold the school board a lot on which a brick schoolhouse was built. It was located at the Y intersection of Locust Grove Road and Old Orchard Road. The schoolhouse opened in the fall of 1859. This old newspaper clipping shows 30 students in front of that initial Stony Brook one-room schoolhouse in 1908. The schoolhouse was last used for the 1912-1913 school year, after it was closed and sold. The structure was used as a residence for a number of years. I haven't been able to determine exactly when, but it was later demolished. The reason it was demolished and given up as a schoolhouse, a second and larger Stony Brook one-room schoolhouse was built further north along Locust Grove Road, replacing this initial Stony Brook one-room schoolhouse. This is a neat schoolhouse. It's the only stone schoolhouse in Springsbury Township. Unfortunately, it no longer stands. This photo is from 1949, and on August 26, 1873, Michael Dietz and Eliza, his wife, provided a lot on which to build the schoolhouse. It was located in terms of present roads at the southeast corner of Widgewood Road and Memory Lane Extended. Upon that lot, Mount Zion Schoolhouse was constructed the following year, with the first classes occurring during the 1874-1875 school year. Irma Throne taught 3 terms at this schoolhouse, spanning the years 1932 through 1935. The schoolhouse was last used to educate students during 1952. Afterwards, the structure was used as a storage building for a number of years prior to being demolished. This is an often overlooked schoolhouse in Pleasureville. On February 1st, 1875, the school board purchased a lot on the northern end of Pleasureville and immediately began construction of a 2-room schoolhouse. This schoolhouse was constructed as a 2-story building. Each classroom had its own entrance. The right entrance was into the primary classroom for grades 1 through 4. That classroom covered the entire first floor. Entering the left entrance, one climbed the stairs into the grammar classroom for grades 5 through 8. That classroom covered the entire second floor. And you can actually see in the central window here, you can see the stairway to the second floor. So they would go in that door and climb the stairway to the second floor for the grammar classroom. One can see, like I said, that there's, if you count them, there are 61 students here. So, and the sign actually says Pleasureville Schools. So it's both the Pleasureville Primary and the Pleasureville Grammar Schools classes are both in this photo. So it's 61 students there. The schoolhouse is located on the east side of North Sherman Street, just prior to reaching the baseball field, which is on the opposite side of the street. The building was last used for schooling prior to the prior to 1929. The structure still stands today, repurposed as a duplex, and it's at 2685 and 2687 North Sherman Street. I have a picture of it as it stands today a little bit later. Now, this 1941 photo shows a brick one-room schoolhouse located along the east side of Stonewood Road, a short distance south of Old Orchard Road. The school was established in 1889 when, on August 2nd, township farmer and Mennonite preacher David Whitmer deeded the land for Whitmer Schoolhouse to the Spring Garden School District for $1. Offering land for schoolhouses for only $1 nearly always resulted in the schoolhouse being named after the benefactor, especially if they contributed materials to its construction, which I found in the newspaper article which he did. So he contributed the land and some material. So you get your school named after you then. Whitmer Schoolhouse was completed in time for the opening of the classes during the 1889-1890 school year. At the time, the school term was 6 months, October through March. So we progressed from 1849 to 1889, you're going from 4-month school year to a 6-month school year. October through March, so you still had time, people on farms, they could put the crops in and harvest them before they went to school. Following the 1952 school year, it was one of the last 5 one-room schoolhouses that closed in Springettsbury Township. Whitmer's one-room schoolhouse still stands today after being utilized for a number of businesses, which did not significantly alter the structure's appearance. More on that later. One of the survivors. Now, the need for additional classrooms to serve the fast-growing southern end of Pleasureville resulted in the school district of Springettsbury Township constructing its initial schoolhouse, that is, as a separate entity from the school district of Spring Garden Township. On April 26, 1898, Edwin Locks, who owned a mill down the street, sold a lot along North Sherman Street at Skyline Drive to the school district, on which they constructed a brick schoolhouse named Grandview. It's actually right at the peak of the hill there in Pleasureville. They opened in the fall of 1898. Some more recent histories describe this as a 2-room schoolhouse. However, all early 1900s newspaper articles and all early school directories consistently only ever show 1 teacher assigned to the schoolhouse. So I count this as a 1-room schoolhouse. The photo shows the school's 32 students during 1923 with their teacher, Mrs. Carrie Kaltreiter, at the left end. As far as class sizes go, you basically see anywhere from 15 students to as many, I've seen like 48 students in one of these rooms, 1-room schoolhouses. So it varied all over the place, but whenever you got above 35, that was very crowded. And sometimes you'd have people 3 to a seat in that instance, which was very, you understand the size of these double desks is about like that. So 3 people in there would be really pushing it. This building was last used for schooling purposes during 1929. The structure still stands today, since expanded many times, and for 43 years it was repurposed as Klein's Food Market. Yep. Now, in 1941, this is a 1941 photo, it shows the second of 3 schoolhouses named Stony Brook in Springettsbury Township. It opened in the... For this schoolhouse, Edwin and Barbie Hauser sold the school district a lot located on the east side of Locust Grove Road, nearly opposite Stone Ridge Road. This larger one-room schoolhouse replaced the first Stony Brook one-room schoolhouse, which was a smaller building, which was located a short distance south along Locust Grove Road. This was the final one-room schoolhouse constructed by the school district of Springettsbury Township. As was the case with earlier one-room schoolhouses in the township, the schoolhouse did not have any modern conveniences. That is, it was heated by the coal stove, it had no electricity and no indoor toilets. However, the schoolhouse did have one new feature that was being pushed by educators at that time. That is overly large windows. So you can see at the right side, the overly large windows, bank of overly large windows. So that was something that if you put those in, the state would reimburse you for doing that because this was an incentive by the state education department. So they had better quality light in the schoolhouse. Now, topic 2 is a look at the early schooling experiences by students and teachers in the schoolhouses introduced in part 1. Early free common schooling only went as far as 8th grade. Irma Throne was a student in the second Stony Brook one-room schoolhouse, as we just saw in the previous slide. One of the overlooked advantages of one-room schools was with 8 grades all in one room by one teacher, allowed teachers to easily conduct trial periods when they advanced apparently deserving students 1 grade at midterm. If it worked out, the student stayed advanced 1 grade. And if it did not work out, the trial simply ended. Now, Irma was able to advance 2 grades during her schooling in the one-room schoolhouse. So she finished the 8 grades in 6 years. And I have been surprised how common that was because it was so easy to do because the teachers could see how the student advanced versus the next grade because they were sitting in the next seat to them usually. So it's like, this is a new finding of me, on my part. Okay. In these early schoolhouses, especially if the weather was cold, and remember, most of these early schools, they were going over the winter predominantly. So it's usually like October through March. So it was cold almost all the time. So an observation by former students always seems to come up concerning the coal or wood-burning potbelly stoves, which was the centerpiece of early schoolhouses. The stove provided the only heat in the cold winter days. As a result, the temperature and ventilation in the one-room buildings rarely suited everybody. This 1949 photo shows the interior of Whitmer's one-room schoolhouse. Here, the coal-fired stove is surrounded by students' desks. The metal shield served 2 purposes. It was a safety measure to help guard against students accidentally touching the hot stove and to shield the closer students from roasting. The school board would provide a covered outdoor pile of coal or a stack of firewood. Some schoolhouses had a basement and they stored the coal or the firewood downstairs. Sometimes the teacher sometimes found this difficult to operate a coal stove, at which time she would usually employ some of the older boys to do that task. Although it was the teacher's responsibility, and if the students were doing it, she was supposed to pay them. Now, she wasn't getting paid much to begin with, so it was like, so most school teachers learn very fast how to operate these stoves. Whitmer Schoolhouse, one of the two schoolhouses in the Spring Garden region, or the Stony Brook region of Springettsbury Township. When Mrs. Maud Flory Ream, the teacher in the final years at Whitmer's, she was actually noted in a letter that Irma Darren, the teacher at Miller School, wrote in a letter to her husband serving overseas in World War I. Irma wrote, quote, "I'm not the only teacher that has trouble. Maud's kids went on strike this dinner for a new stove. The schoolhouse won't heat, and she had all sorts of troubles with this winter. These Stony Brook kids are sure smart. I can imagine how they behave in school. I guess they don't listen any better than mine." So, and she had other letters that she was writing to her husband about classes in the one-room schools. So I found that neat. Now, this 1947 photo shows students inside a one-room school in a neighboring township. All of the interior photos of local one-room schools, the stove shielding configuration appears to be homemade. They seem like they're all a little different. So evidently there wasn't a company out there providing these shields. Maybe it was too difficult to design one that suited everybody, so nobody did it. So like I said, these are all homemade. Now, in these buildings, I've seen things written about, not necessarily Springsbury Township, but other schools, one-room schools in York Township, or York County, noted that the top surface of the stove was occasionally used to prepare hot lunches for the students. When this was done for all students, this was often a reward for extra good student behavior. For example, the teacher would occasionally cook a pot of rice while teaching morning classes, and then at lunchtime, the teacher would spoon that out into bowls, and then the class would line up, and they'd each get a spoonful of jelly or preserves on top of the rice. So that was their hot meal reward for being good. On other days, a large pot was made available to the students in which they would drop a potato with their initials carved in it, and it would cook during the morning, and at lunchtime, they'd have a hot baked potato for lunch. So essentially, and I've heard these a number of times, so they're probably true. Now, the school bell was rung usually at 8:30 in the morning, and that was a signal that you have a half hour to get to the school, because at 9 o'clock school started, which meant the students were expected to be present and seated. Most schools had a large cast bell hung in a belfry at the top of the school. This was so sound would carry a long distance. This photo shows the inside of Miller's one-room schoolhouse, taught by Irma Darren, so she's actually in this picture. During the first day of school in September of 1947. That year, there were 21 students in grades 1 through 7. There was no students in the 8th grade at that time. So in that whole territory available to them, there were no 8th grade students. The length of the school year had reached 9 months. So by 1947, you have your existing 9-month school year established. The length of the school year, basically, or I lost my line there. It's like, okay, the 21 students in this school represented 60% capacity of the school building. However, there were years when Miller's was at the 36 student full capacity, at which time all students shared a double desk. So you can see on the right side there, you see 2 students sharing a double desk. So once you get to 37 students, 3 of the students had to share one of those desks. Now, the first day of school each year was significant to most students. It was the day seats were selected and usually kept throughout the whole year. The combination desks and seats were all one size fits all, although some schools did have gradually increasing size desks. A few teachers assigned seats. However, most allowed students to select their seats while following the general guidelines of the lower grades up front and the higher grades to the back of the room. Some students preferred to be near a window, even knowing it would be the coldest part of the room during the winter. Maybe the students wanted to be near the stove. Other students wanted to sit next to the same friend. There were students who would sit next to the same friend in the double desk for all 8 grades. I heard this story a couple times, and I know it's true because my mom, Esther Smith, and her friend Mary King shared the same double desk all 8 years that they attended Brenneman's one-room school in York Township. So I have firsthand knowledge it's true. Now, this is a restored one-room schoolhouse where the potbelly stove is primarily for show. It doesn't have any shield around it. I use it to illustrate the inside front of a one-room schoolhouse. The teacher's desk was often on a platform at the front of the room. These platforms are probably left over from, yeah, he agrees, from when it was a one-room school. So the teacher would sit up on this platform, and the blackboards, students would be called up by grade level and read aloud to the teacher or to solve math problems on the blackboard, which would have been along these walls. Now, featured in the room were the American flag plus paintings of President Abraham Lincoln and President George Washington. Now, a congressional mandate passed in 1932 to commemorate the 200th anniversary of George Washington's birth in 1732. That mandate required a portrait of President George Washington to hang in every classroom in the nation. This is the portrait selected by most schools. I have never seen when that was rescinded, but they stopped putting his picture up in schools as the Consolidated school districts came about. So I don't know what happened with this. So everybody seems to be violating that mandate. But also you have a picture of Abraham Lincoln. And this is the picture that most schools selected when they selected a picture of Abraham Lincoln to place in their school. Now, the school day began with opening exercises consisting of students rising, facing the flag, placing their hand over their heart, and reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. Some schools followed the pledge with either singing America or the Star-Spangled Banner. The teacher next read 10 verses of Scripture, usually from the Old Testament, followed by students reciting the Lord's Prayer. In the front of the room were pieces of wood painted black that would serve as a blackboard. For some schools that could afford slate blackboards, and York County actually was one of the states where, because of all the slate quarries in the southern York County, almost every school in York County had a slate blackboard because of that. So this was with the exception. Now, students would be called to the front of the room to write answers on the blackboard, but they also used slates. Beginners was the name often used for first graders. Reading classes for beginners were held first thing in the day. These students gradually were taught to print letters of the alphabet and to form words using these letters. The later method demanded the student recognize the whole word, so phonics, which were stressed earlier, were not stressed as much, and flashcards were heavily used. The first graders would often practice writing letters and words on the individual slate about 12 inches by 9 inches. Practice work could begin, after the practice work began for the beginners, students were then taught in the older grades, and they progress up through the morning and covering all the other grades. Now, the math classes for grades 2 through 8 were usually held, again, at the earliest part of the day. It was thought students were more alert then. Simple math problems could be done on the slate, and later on, they would be called to the board to do more. But so they would be doing these math exercises as the teacher walked around the room checking their work. And so she would, as she walked down the aisle, she'd be checking, like, if she'd be at the back of the room, she'd be checking the 8th grade, and then 7th grade, 6th grade. So they'd be all, and they'd be, she would have to multitask very good, put it that way. She or he. Now, if some students were having difficulties with math, the teacher could have their exercises, continue their exercises on individual slates while she read history or geography lessons to the other students. So basically, she was giving history, geography lessons as she was walking around checking their math scores. So they did a lot back then. I guess they still do a lot today, teachers. Now, a 15-minute recess was held mid-morning. It was the choice of the individual teacher to join the students on the playground or not. Some teachers used the time to correct classwork of the older students, and some would join the students in the playground to observe or sometimes teach a new game. Marbles was widely played schoolyard game. The caption notes, "Here the students have spring fever, running barefoot at recess," since it was nearly the end of the school year. The English classes were in session beginning mid-morning, beginning after mid-morning recess to noon. English was a big part of the school day, where you learn spelling, punctuation. So in addition to the regular lessons during school hour, there was a booklet of 100 or 1,000 words for the next York County Annual Spelling Contest, where students could study during their free time and at home. Most students were eager to earn the title of best speller in their school. If they so advanced to the contest as best speller in their municipality, so the best speller in Springettsbury Township, they were then advanced to the county spelling bee. It was considered quite an honor to reach the county level, where there were actually cash prizes for the best spellers. Now, at lunchtime, there was a 1-hour lunch break. Those carrying lunch utilized a lunch basket or a metal lunch pail of various styles pictured. The larger pails usually contained several lunches. So if a family had 3 children in this school, they would pack all the lunches in one container. And I talked to a lady that her grandma would always deliver the lunch pail of, she had several children in the same school. She would deliver the lunch pail right before lunch, and she would pick it up right after lunch every day. So she was, and she had so much stuff in there that it was shared with, after their children ate, it was shared with everybody else in the room. Like she was providing lunch for the whole classroom, pretty much. So that was kind of neat. Most of the schools did not have wells. And the closest homeowner to the school was expected to make water available for school's use. Boys attending school were basically assigned day by day to carry pails of water from the well or spring in the neighboring house. One pail of water was used to wash up, and all students and teachers used that same pail of water. And another thing was the drinking water. Another pail of water was poured into a ceramic crock equipped with a push-button faucet. My mom talked about that push button faucet, I don't know how often. It's like, she said, that was the big thing, is going up, first grader, pushing the push button faucet and getting water out of that jug. But they were usually common drinking cups that everybody used, although some students would bring their own cups. So several trips a day to the neighboring house was usually necessary to fulfill the washing water and the drinking water needs for the day, depending on the size of the school, number of school students in that school. Now, after noon lunch period, reading was usually included as a dose, included with a dose of geography and history. So whenever they're reading stories, it included history, geography, other subjects. An important part of each subject was recitation, which was done up in front of the teacher. With all 8 grades in one room, all students learned important things that the older students were studying. So as they were doing their own exercises, they could choose to listen to what the older students are learning and pick up stuff. And this is how many of the students that were able to skip grades, they decided, I know what I'm doing here in this grade, I'll listen to what the upper grades are going. So when they showed the teacher what they knew, they were able to skip a grade. So, and skipping a grade was actually more common than I expected. It's like, I found numerous articles. I actually found one state report that they said that 10% or 10% was the highest level that they've ever had as far as number of students skipping a grade in the school. And that was around 1923, I think it was. So 10%, it was a high level then. It's like now you don't have anything near 10% in any of the schools. Now, you had a 15-minute recess held mid-afternoon. Most of the time, students were free to do their own thing during recess, playing a game with friends or playing in the snow, or actually sledding down a hill in the snow, climbing trees. However, occasionally the teacher would gather all students for a common game. Many times, one of the games would be circle games, and there are all kinds of circle games I've heard names of. I don't know the rules of most of them, but I know a few of them. But they had a lot of games back then. There were times when the students did not use individual slates to practice writing. Penmanship was practiced on sheets of paper. Some of them were already printed with parts of sayings, such as practice makes perfect, haste makes waste, the early bird gets the worm, and you were expected to fill in the missing words. The students were taught to make straight, curvy lines with a pencil before making letters. Often the exercises were done individually while the teacher was teaching the other grades. For most subjects, a lot of memorization was required. They were required to get up in front of the teacher and basically tell stories recite stories from memory to memorization of names of states, counties, and their capitals. Again, students did this individually, the memorization, while the students were teaching the other grades. Now, an examination was given at the end of the 8th grade. It was used to determine if students could proceed on to high school. At the discretion of the teacher, some students were allowed to take the exam after 7 years of schooling, and a few were allowed to take the exam after 6 years of the schooling. So Emma Throne passed the high school exam after completing 6 years of schooling. And that was kind of the ultimate test if they were allowed to continue since they skipped grades. So the high school the 8th grade diploma exam was given countywide, and like I said, it was, if you didn't pass that, you didn't get to go to high school. You had to basically repeat another year at elementary school, or grades 1 through 8 school. All of the 8th grades of free public education in the county, most in the Central School District went to either after they completed their 8th grades and they passed this exam. Most of them that chose to go to high school went to Pelham High School, they went to North York High School or York High. The exception was the Springsbury Independent School District, which had a special arrangement with York City Schools for education above the 8th grade. Now, as far as Emma Throne, she attended Pelham High School. And even though, again, skipping a grade in high school, she graduated at the top of her class. So she's a graduate of the Pelham High class of 1923. She wanted to go to Millersville. Now, she's only 15 years old. She graduated high school when she was 15 years old. Millersville would not accept her because their minimum age was 16. So she decided to take classes, advanced classes, with the senior class of Wrightsville High School, where she also graduated at the top of her class of 1924 at Wrightsville High School. So she's top of her class at 16 years old. So she's a valedictorian at 2 high schools in York County. Then, at 16-year-old, she started at Millsville and graduated the class in 1926. Not at the top of her class, but near it. That fall, 18-year-old Emma Throne started her teaching career at Miller's one-room schoolhouse in Springettsbury Township. And 44 years later, Irma retired from teaching Central School District during 1970. Now, Irma married Frank Durone in 1940, and he actually built many of the houses in Springsbury Township. So you might have a Frank Durone house. Now, teachers and students of one-room schools often mention the various forms of punishment. They talk about it fondly now, but probably not back then. All done to instill discipline and maintain control within the classroom and on the playground. They could be as simple as a dunce cap or a painful rap on the knuckles with a ruler. Another form of punishment was writing, this boy is writing, "I was a bad boy," 100 times on the blackboard, often done while other students are at recess. So that's one form of punishment. The more stringent punishment is spanking with a rod. This could be administered for crimes such as, or misbehaving, such as throwing something in class, throwing spitballs, or fighting at recess. Now, one-room school teachers that I talked to, they said probably the most useful punishment was denying recess. So while the other kids are out playing in recess, you had to sit at your seat. He said that was the most useful form of punishment. People did not want to miss recess. And the last, from their beginning until their end, one-room schoolhouses did not have indoor restroom facilities. Built near the school were outhouses used by the students and teachers. These tiny structures did not have any water, were only big enough for just one person. The human waste dropped through a hole in the bench into a pit. The cutout in the upper part of the door had 3 purposes: to allow sunlight to enter, to aid in ventilation, and to designate use. A crescent moon was usually for the girls and a shining sun for the boys. Now, several times a day, either the teacher or a student, usually as punishment, scattered a cup of ash or lime over the waste to reduce the smell. The dominant student memory of these outhouses were on cold, winter, windy days. They hated to leave the comfort of the schoolhouse to trot out to this unheated building that usually swayed in the wind. So that was not, they said, I don't like to think about that a lot. But that was the thing. Now, how many has ever used an outhouse? Almost everybody. So we're going to the third topic. And that is an overview of the modern schools, which were first built in Springettsbury Township by the Springettsbury Independent School District. Okay, shout out the features that define a modern school. Lights, that's good.
Indoor plumbing.
Indoor plumbing, very good. So that's the number one one, and also number two one probably. So essentially, electric lights were the big one. Evenly heated rooms were another big one because you could adjust the thermostat, or in the early days, a valve on a radiator. Also, good ventilation was another one. A lot of the early modern schoolhouses, the earliest ones, did not have transportation provided, although later the state designated a modern schoolhouse as one that provided transportation to anybody that lived more than 1.5 miles from the school. So we'll look at those schoolhouses. First of all, remember this territory map showing the region where each schoolhouse drew their students. The blue territory for Lefevre's one-room schoolhouse down in this area was basically expanding larger than any of the other areas in the township. It was supplying 43 students to that cramped schoolhouse during the 1910-1911 school year. And that school's population was projected to soon eclipse 50 as the East York development in Springsbury Township was taking off. Now, some East York residents had already started to take matters into their own hands by sending their young children to city schools using the trolley. They were thus paying school taxes in Springsbury Township plus tuitions to city schools. And rather than paying both places, they used the courts to establish the Springsbury Independent School District in the territory of Lefevre's one-room school. Now, this territory is generally west of Route 24 and south of Whiteford Road, with some exceptions, which I'll get into. So, the pictured Easton two-room schoolhouse along Philadelphia Street in the East York development and the short-lived Longstown one-room schoolhouse, which only lasted a few years, located high on the hill along Mountain Rose Avenue, were the two initial schools constructed by the Springsbury Independent School District. Both of these were considered modern buildings, and they opened in the 1912-1913 school years. The schoolhouses had electric lights, running water, and indoor bathrooms. The independent school district residents were willing to pay higher taxes than the overall Springsbury Township school districts to have schools on par with those in the city. Now, year over year, when I checked the property taxes, the independent school district was many years paying as much as double the millage rate as residents in the remainder of Springsbury Township. Now, some of those higher taxes were also going to a fund that the independent school district was creating that paid high school tuition to city schools for any independent school district's child that wanted to further their education above 8th grade. So it was like light years ahead of the rest of the township at that time. Now, the Yorkshire two-room schoolhouse of the Springsbury Independent School District opened in the fall of 1925. It faced Maywood Road at the northwest corner with Fifth Avenue and was financed by Milton Haynes. The schoolhouse had modern conveniences and features a finished basement that could be used as a playroom or for an occasional community event. The schoolhouse was leased at $1 per year to the Springsbury Independent School Board. That lease lasted until 1947, when the school board started to contemplate additions to the building, at which time it was purchased along with the playground from Milton Haynes. Now looking at modern schools within Springettsbury Township School District in the rest of the township. In the mid-1920s, the state of Pennsylvania started to provide incentives for school consolidation within municipalities as a means to push faster improvements in school facilities. To be eligible for this special funding assistance on a new school building, it had to replace at least 3 schoolhouses and meet the requirements of a modern school building. If so doing, the new school building was a recognized consolidated school building. So if you're a recognized consolidated school building, you're basically additional funding was available from the state to help build that school and maintain that school. So they were pushing to get rid of the one-room schoolhouses as much as possible. And actually, this 1940 photo shows the Pleasureville Consolidated School. It opened in the fall of 1929, and it was recognized as the first consolidated schoolhouse in York County. York County was actually lagging behind there because I think it was 85% of all the other counties already had a consolidated school. So York County was one of the last ones to kind of get on board with that. The Pleasureville 4-room consolidated school building at the northwest corner of North Sherman Street and Marion Road replaced 3 schoolhouses strung out along North Sherman Street in the Pleasureville area. These were Hively's 1-room, Grandview, and Pleasureville 2-room. The schoolhouse originally had wood siding. However, when additional rooms were added in 1955, those additional rooms were brick construction. So they actually bricked up this part so it looks like a brick building. So people are like, I went to school and it was wood siding. Why is it brick now? It's like, that's the reason. In 1955, they wanted it all to look the same. Now, early in 1950, get this back. Actually, 1940. In the 1940s, most consolidated school buildings were using busing. Up to that time, they would pay a parent out that's coming in from a long distance to pick up students on the way in, and then they would get paid, provide transportation to the students more than 1.5 miles away. But like I said, about 1940 is when most of the consolidated schoolhouses in York County were using busing to the outlying areas. Now, early in 1950, the school board of Springettsbury Township did the planning to close all the remaining older 1-room and 2-room schoolhouses and replace them with a single modern consolidated schoolhouse. Now, this planning was done at the township level because this occurred 2 years prior to the central joint school system consolidation. The 8-room consolidated Springettsbury Township School opened in the fall of 1952 in the eastern end of the county, or eastern end of the township, situated along Whitmer Road, where the present southern part of the township park is now located. Irma Darren taught 2nd grade and 3rd grade at Springettsbury Township School from 1952 to 1957. The school was renamed Springettsbury Elementary after Central York School District took the ownership of it. Now, this map of Central York School District, in 1952, the Central Joint School System consolidated the school districts of Springsbury Township, outside of the Springettsbury Independent School District, North York Borough, and Manchester Township, as shown on this map. Initially using 2 consolidated schoolhouses as Pleasureville Elementary and Springettsbury Elementary, the Central York School District added the following school buildings within Springettsbury Township. North Hills Elementary, which opened in 1957, which I went to. North Hills Junior High, which opened in 1961, which I went to, and Stony Brook Elementary, which opened in 1966, and the new Central York High School, which opened in 2005. Now, when I went to school at Central, ninth grade English class was always writing an autobiography. Both I had to do it, my two sisters had to do it, my two brothers had to do it that came after me. So how many had to write an autobiography in their English class? Okay, I'm getting at least 6, 7, 8. That's good. It's like, do you know how many years that was done? Probably not. I'm still trying to find out when they stopped doing that. I thought that was neat. Because every now and then my sisters would pull this out and they'd read what they wrote and they'd give me a call. And because when I wrote mine, pretty much all my two younger, all my brothers and sisters are younger than me. So they kind of took all the parts of mine that they wanted for theirs and and it went down through the line, and now they only want the full autobiography with all the pictures is my youngest sister. Now, essentially, this map of York Suburban School District, I only look at the extreme northeastern end to show the difference. Usually, the Lefevre school line was actually Route 24. There's actually a bump out along south of the railroad and between the railroad and Market Street. There's a bump out in that end because one of the school directors, Rob Fry, I guess his grandfather, right? He was one of the school directors and he wanted to be included in the independent school district. And since they bumped that out, they actually bumped in the other side. So that's the reason you have that odd shape over there. So one school director is having its way. And that's still like these were the boundaries determined by the independent school district in 1912. They're still the boundaries of the York Suburban School District because when the independent school district decided to form up with the Spring Garden School District to form York Suburban School District, that's the boundaries. So people always ask me, it's like when they were working on potentially developing Bloomingdale and they're telling me, I never saw anything about it I'm always looking in the Central School District about the properties. I said, well, you have to look at the York Suburban School District for that property. So, because they didn't realize that's in York Suburban. So, now, nearing an end here, I have the fourth topic is a quick look at the survivors, the 8 repurposed schoolhouses still standing in Springettsbury Township. I'll look at them from the youngest to the oldest. So the youngest is Pleasureville Consolidated. And this is a picture of it in 2001. Pleasurable Consolidated Schoolhouse opened in 1929. The school was later renamed Pleasureville Elementary, and in 1955, additional classrooms were added. Students were taught in the modern schoolhouse until 1982. This particular building remains actually in the school district. It's now the Central York Educational Service Center, housing the administrative offices of the school district at 775 Marion Road. The community honor roll to those that served in World Wars, Korean War, and Vietnam stands in front of the North Sherman Street side of the building. The Stony Brook one-room schoolhouse that opened in 1913 after no longer being needed for educating students, this schoolhouse was sold in 1952 for $4,800. This 2021 photo shows the Stony Brook one-room schoolhouse as it stands today. It is presently repurposed as a hair styling salon at 101 Locust Grove Road. Easton School opened as a modern two-room schoolhouse in 1912 with additional classrooms added on several occasions. After no longer being needed for educating students in 1978, this modern schoolhouse was sold to Living World Community Church for $40,000. Today, that building still stands at 2309 East Philadelphia Street in the Old East York neighborhood. This 2021 photo shows this former schoolhouse, which was repurposed as high-end apartments in 2018. Grandview one-room schoolhouse opened in 1898. This one-room schoolhouse, last used for schooling purposes during 1929, was sold for $800. This 2021 photo shows the structure as it still stands at 2406 North Sherman Street. The original schoolhouse has seen numerous additions plus installation of roof dormers, and for 43 years, from 1949 to 1992, Klein's Food Market utilized this. Whitmer's one-room schoolhouse opened in 1889. After no longer being needed for educating students in 1952, it was sold for $1,130. No substantial changes were made to the schoolhouse by several subsequent businesses, such as a copy shop operated by Donald Fitz and a dress shop known as Kit and Caboodle, operated by Catherine Fitz. From about 2000 to 2010, this structure sat vacant. Brush had overgrown the structure and the east wall was in danger of collapse. However, Nick Kokorunis purchased the property in 2010. He was responsible for restoring structural integrity of the Whitmer's one-room schoolhouse. The schoolhouse still stands today along the east side of Stonewood Road, just south of Old Orchard Road, as seen in this 2021 photo. This older style two-room schoolhouse opened in 1875 along North Sherman Street in the northern end of Pleasureville. The schoolhouse was last used for schooling purposes in 1929, after which it was sold for $400. As shown in this 2022 photo, the two-story schoolhouse has since been repurposed as a duplex property at 2685 and 2687 North Sherman Street. Miller's one-room schoolhouse opened in 1857. After no longer being needed for educating students in 1952, this one-room schoolhouse was sold for $2,825. As shown in this 2022 photo, the schoolhouse has long since been repurposed as a residence and still stands at 3565 Heindel Road. It's the one where you go around the schoolhouse and it looks like you're driving into the backyard of the property. Actually, now they're widening the road next to it. So if you see construction in that area, it's going to be a two-lane road right next to it now. But it still curves around the school. And the oldest schoolhouse still standing in Springettsbury Township is the Glazed two-room schoolhouse. So this older style two-room schoolhouse opened about 1850 at the Y intersection of Brook Valley Road and Trout Run Road. The schoolhouse was last used for schooling purposes during the 1952 school year, after which the school district used it for storage for a few years before selling it in December 16, 1954 for $3,750. Whereupon the wall separating the two classrooms was removed, and in 1955, William Latterman opened the Glazed auction in this combined larger single room that still exists today. Beulah Latterman later sold the property to Janet Stein in 1975, after which further improvements were made to the property that we see today. Now, in the 1960s, if you visited this schoolhouse, you probably saw Cliff Shatterwith drawing scenes from the area and getting his inspiration for paintings and doing sketches here. So I'll share 3 of them to close this presentation. Cliff titled this painting A Night Out at Glazed Auction. So this is the 1950s. Gathering a place in the evening. Cliff was a master at pencil drawings. A lot of the pencil drawings he did, he'd sit there and create this at this, just like you're creating a photograph. He'd sit there and draw. I've seen him draw, how fast he draws things, and it's amazing. And the detail here. I got a picture of one of the mills in Springettsbury Township from him. It's all pencil drawing. He was going to color it, and he actually have little letters on, like the colors that he was going to put in later on, but it's all pencil. It's a fantastic drawing. I'll have it at my next presentation. So this detailed pencil sketch, I have to say, when my parents moved to Springsbury Township in January of 1958, I was 8 years old. During the late 50s and early 60s, whenever Dad attended glazed auctions, he was usually looking for some tools or something useful. He wasn't in the antiques. It always had to be something useful. So I usually went along with him. Now, raise your hand if you ever attended an auction in this building. Wow, most people. A lingering memory of those visits to Glazed auction is summed up in this final painting by Cliff, in which he titled, "Smoke-filled auction room is not from stove." Usually a layer of cigar and cigarette smoke in this building. Every time I would get home with my dad, my thing Mom would say, "You've been to Glazed again." She could smell the cigar smoke. So that's the end of this presentation. Pretty much on time. I'll entertain any questions. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you. Thanks for coming out tonight.